A few words about this final piece, this leg of the journey here through the early, middle, and late quartets. Towards the end of Beethoven's life, he was approached by a friend of his, a violinist named Carl Holz, who played second violin in what was by that time known as the Schuppanzig Quartet. It had been the Razumovsky Quartet. And they had played all of the late quartets, not necessarily performed them, but they had learned them. And Carl Holz approached Beethoven and he said, "So, Maestro, which is your favorite of your late quartets?" And he was evasive. He said, "Each in its own way. Art demands that we not stand still." And as we've seen, I mean, he was always forging ahead into uncharted territories. That was his artistic credo. But eventually, he admitted that if he had to choose, the one we're going to hear, this penultimate quartet in C-sharp minor, really was his favorite. He wrote it in the summer of 1826, which is about 10 months before the end of his life. And if Opus 59, number 1, which we just heard, was so mystifying that Schuppanzig couldn't understand it and Bernard Romberg stepped on it, this piece was so incomprehensible to the people at the time, it was so avant-garde, that it was ignored by the publishers and by the public at large. It was not performed until 1835, which is a full 9 years after it was composed. It traces, as you will see, this vast, unbroken 7-movement arc of, it's about 35 minutes long, and it just goes across this huge landscape of moods and styles and forms. It starts in a rather world-weary fugue in C-sharp minor, and then suddenly we're in a kind of a jig-like D major rondo, and from there there's a short recitative which takes us across to the central keystone of this arch of movements, a large 13-minute theme and variations, and then there's a scherzo and trio, which is rather childlike and prankish, and then there's a G-sharp minor operatic aria, and finally this very fierce, defiant final movement coming back to C-sharp minor. And the fact that it traverses this huge territory and yet brings all of this disparate information together in this coherent tapestry, I think, is why it was Beethoven's favorite. And it certainly was a favorite of many of the most visionary composers who followed in his wake. Schubert, for instance, lying on his deathbed in November of 1828, had heard about this piece, and he told Carl Holz, "Bring a group into my chamber here, play it for me," and they did. And this was the description of his response. Carl Holz said, "Schubert fell into such a state of excitement and enthusiasm that we were all frightened for him." His comment at the completion of the performance was, "After this, what is there left for us to write?" And Robert Schumann, some years later, said, "It seems to me to stand on the extreme boundary of all that has hitherto been attained by human art and imagination." And Wagner was a great fan of Beethoven, and in honor of the centennial of his birth in 1870, he wrote a long essay about this piece. I'll read you the first paragraph. He said, "If we wish to form a picture in the day of the life of our sacred genius, Beethoven, we can do no better than to derive it from one of his own marvelous compositions. To illustrate such a typical day from Beethoven's inner life, I choose the great C-sharp minor quartet." And in this long essay that he wrote, he spoke poetically about each of the different movements in the piece. And I'll read you what he said about the first movement, which is this world-weary fugue. "The long opening adagio is certainly the saddest utterance ever made in notes. It is at the same time a penitential prayer and a communing with God out of a firm belief in the eternal good." And I'll play you the fugue subject because it's worth remembering. And then it wends its way across 6 minutes of expansion, then through all of those different movements and permutations. And in the end, it comes full circle back to C-sharp minor. And of course, Wagner knew a thing or two about ring-like structures. And so he described the last movement thusly: "This is the fury of the world's dance. Fierce pleasure, agony, ecstasy of love, anger, passion, and suffering, lightning flashes and thunder rolls." And we hear the first theme of this last movement galloping across the musical landscape like the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And finally, it devolves into this lamenting, exotic-sounding theme. And I think at some subliminal level, we begin to think, this sounds familiar, the circle is closing. And in fact, if I play you the beginning of it again, and I play the fugue theme, you hear they are just inversions of each other at different tempos, but it's the same music turned upside down. And in the end, all roads seem to lead back to that fugue theme in this incredible moment of climax. And so maybe that's why it was Beethoven's favorite piece, because in a sense it summed up not just what had come before in this piece, but in a way everything that had come before in his life. And of course, the reason we keep returning to drink from the well of Beethoven is that he, of all composers, was able to sum up his joys and his sorrows in music of great reconciliation and ennobling qualities. And so you have that to look forward to. So enjoy it.